The courtroom air was heavy, the kind of silence that pressed against everyone's chest. Reporters sat hunched over notepads, pens poised, waiting for a headline. Families of children sat tightly packed on the benches, their faces drawn, some clasping tissues in white-knuckled grips. The defendant, a man in his late 40s, neatly dressed in a gray suit, sat at the defense table with his attorneys. His face was still, almost smug, as though he were confident that this day would end in his favor. He had been the owner of a daycare center, once trusted by dozens of parents in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He was supposed to be the man who cared for children, who kept them safe while their mothers and fathers went to work. Instead, he was accused of something unthinkable, abusing the very children he was supposed to protect. The charges ranged from neglect to outright physical harm. For months, investigators had gathered evidence, interviewed distraught parents, and searched for a way to give voice to victims who were far too young to understand what had happened to them, let alone describe it. The prosecution faced a nearly impossible task. How could one build a case when the primary victims were toddlers? Children barely able to string sentences together? Parents had testified about the sudden changes in their children's behavior, the nightmares, the crying fits, the unexplained bruises. Experts gave their professional opinions. But without a clear witness, the defense insisted it was nothing but speculation. Children fall. Children bruise easily. Children imagine things. The defense attorney repeated again and again. The jury seemed torn. Some nodded at the defense's arguments. Others looked pained, uncertain, glancing at the families as though searching for the truth in their tear-stained faces. The trial had reached a critical point, and tension was rising with each passing minute. That was when the judge, an older man with silver hair and a commanding presence, leaned forward and announced something that made the entire room shift. The prosecution has indicated they wish to bring in a child witness, he said, his voice firm, but measured. The defense immediately objected. Your Honor, this is absurd. The child in question is 3 years old. 3. Hardly old enough to comprehend truth versus fantasy. We cannot allow this courtroom to turn into a circus, but the prosecution countered. The court must understand. This child has shown recognition, memory, and with support, is able to respond in meaningful ways. We ask the court to allow her testimony, accompanied by appropriate support measures. A ripple moved across the gallery. Reporters exchanged glances. Some already scribbled frantically in their notebooks. A 3-year-old? Testifying in court? It was nearly unheard of. The judge paused, his brow furrowed. Everyone leaned forward, waiting. Finally, he gave a slow nod. I will allow it, he declared. The witness will be permitted under special conditions. The defense attorney slammed his hand on the table, whispering furiously to his client. But the decision stood. It was then that people noticed something else. Sitting quietly in the corner of the courtroom was a large German shepherd, its handler beside it. The dog wore a vest that read Police Canine Comfort Unit. He wasn't there to sniff out drugs or chase suspects. He had been trained for a different role, to provide comfort for children and vulnerable witnesses. His steady presence was meant to ease fear and anxiety, giving frightened victims the courage to speak. Until now, the dog had gone unnoticed. But as soon as the judge's ruling echoed through the room, eyes turned toward him. Some jurors raised their brows in surprise. Others leaned slightly forward, curious. The defense scoffed. Now we're bringing dogs into testimony? The lead attorney muttered under his breath. But he knew this development could be dangerous. A jury's emotions were powerful, and animals had a way of softening even the hardest hearts. The prosecutor rose from her seat, adjusting the papers in her hand. She was a woman in her 40s, sharp but empathetic, with years of experience handling sensitive cases. She knew the risks of bringing a child this young into court, But she also knew the importance of her testimony. Without it, justice might slip away. The courtroom doors creaked. Everyone's attention snapped to the back. The guardian of the child stepped in first, holding a tiny hand. And then came the witness. A little girl, with pigtails tied neatly, wearing a simple yellow dress that looked too big for her small frame. She clutched a small stuffed rabbit in her free hand, its ear worn down from too many nights of being hugged. The moment she appeared, the atmosphere shifted. The weight of what was happening settled on every shoulder in that room. She was just a child, barely past toddlerhood. She should have been playing in a park or coloring at a table, not walking into a courtroom full of strangers, not facing the man who had haunted so many nights for so many families. The little girl's steps were slow, hesitant. She looked around, eyes wide, filled with confusion and fear. She saw the jury, the judge, the lawyers, and finally, her gaze fell on the defendant. For a moment, she froze. Her small body tensed as she tightened her grip on her guardian's hand. The room seemed to hold its breath. Would she cry? Would she turn and refuse to walk forward? But then, something else caught her eye. The police dog. He sat calmly, ears perked, eyes soft and steady. To her, he wasn't a uniformed officer or a piece of evidence. He was just a dog. And in that instant, he became something more than a trained canine. He became a lifeline. The little girl let go of her guardian's hand. Slowly, almost cautiously, she walked across the courtroom, past the wooden benches, past the jurors staring in stunned silence, until she reached the dog. She knelt down beside him, placing her tiny palm on his fur. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply sat there, steady and strong, letting her lean against him as if he'd been waiting for her all along. Gasps and whispers rippled through the courtroom. Some jurors exchanged glances, visibly moved. Even the most hardened skeptic couldn't deny the raw humanity of the moment. The defense attorney rolled his eyes, but his confidence wavered. This wasn't the circus he had warned about. This was something far more dangerous to his case. The prosecutor watched, her lips pressed into a thin line, her heart pounding. This was the moment she had hoped for, the moment that could change everything. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, more to steady himself in the room. He looked down at the small child leaning on the police dog and cleared his throat. "Proceed," he said softly. And so began the testimony no one thought possible. A 3-year-old child, too small for the witness chair, too young for legal jargon, had just walked into the center of justice. The jury waited. The attorneys braced themselves. The dog stood as her silent protector. No one in that room could have predicted what she would say next. The hush inside the courtroom deepened as the little girl stood there, tiny and trembling, her yellow dress brushing her knees. She looked so small in comparison to the vastness of the room. The tall wooden walls, the judge's elevated bench, the jurors leaning forward in their seats. Her hand, once firmly gripping her guardian's fingers, was now free. She had chosen to walk on her own. Every eye followed her as she made her way toward the police dog. The German shepherd sat still, his handler giving a subtle nod of reassurance. The dog didn't wag his tail or lunge forward. He knew his job. He remained steady, calm, a safe anchor for a frightened child in a storm of adults. The little girl crouched beside him, placing her small palm on his thick fur. For a moment, she seemed to forget where she was. Her shoulders eased, her lips parted in a tiny sigh, and her stuffed rabbit dangled loosely from her other hand. She leaned into the dog, and the audience exhaled as though a collective knot had been loosened. The judge cleared his throat softly, reluctant to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the room. Would the witness please approach the stand? He asked gently. The child looked up at the judge, eyes wide and uncertain. She didn't move. Instead, She pressed her face against the dog's neck. A ripple of emotion moved through the jury box. The prosecutor, aware of the moment's delicacy, approached carefully. Kneeling so she wouldn't tower over the child, she spoke in a voice softer than the rustling of papers. "Sweetheart, do you want to sit with your friend?" She gestured toward the stand, where the dog could accompany the little girl. The handler gave a subtle signal, and the shepherd rose, padding calmly toward the witness chair. The child followed him, clutching her stuffed rabbit. When she climbed into the oversized chair, her legs swung freely, far from touching the floor. The police dog sat at her side, close enough for her small hand to reach his back. She placed her palm there instantly, as if drawing strength through his warmth. The jury watched in rapt attention. Some shifted uncomfortably, moved by the innocence of the scene. Others blinked rapidly, fighting the sting of tears. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every detail. The defense, however, was not impressed. The lead attorney leaned toward his client, muttering loud enough for nearby ears, "This is nothing but theatrics. No jury in their right mind should consider this credible." But the jury was considering it. In fact, they couldn't look away. The prosecutor began gently. "Can you tell us your name?" she asked, her tone careful and warm. The little girl opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked at the dog, then at her rabbit. Finally, she whispered her first name, barely audible. The court reporter had to lean in to catch it. "Well done," the prosecutor said softly, smiling with encouragement. "And how old are you?" The girl held up 3 fingers. A quiet chuckle rippled through the gallery, quickly stifled by the gavel. The defense rolled his eyes dramatically. "Your Honor, this is hardly reliable testimony. She can barely answer basic questions." The judge shot him a warning look. "You will allow the prosecution to continue." The prosecutor nodded her thanks and turned back to the child. "Do you remember going to the daycare?" she asked. The child's eyes flickered nervously. Her hand tightened on the dog's fur. For a moment, she seemed frozen, her lip trembling. The dog shifted slightly, leaning into her. It was subtle, but it worked. The girl nodded. "Did you like going there?" the prosecutor asked gently. The courtroom was silent, waiting. The little girl's voice, faint as a feather, escaped her lips. "No." The single word hung in the air like a strike of lightning. The prosecutor let the silence stretch, allowing the jury to absorb it. She could feel the room tightening, the jurors' eyes narrowing, the family's breaths catching. Then, with extraordinary care, she asked, "Can you tell us why not?" The girl froze again. Her eyes darted toward the defendant, who sat stone-faced at the table. He crossed his arms, his gaze hard and cold. The child's small chest rose and fell quickly. She turned her head, buried her face against the dog, and for a moment it seemed the testimony would end there. Silence, fear, and nothing more. But then, something extraordinary happened. The child whispered into the dog's fur, and though no one could hear, she seemed to gather courage from the act. Slowly, she lifted her head. Her lips trembled. And then she said, clear enough for the jury to hear, "Bad man," the room gasped. The words echoed louder than any argument made during the entire trial. Reporters' pens flew across pages. The jury froze. Even the judge blinked in disbelief. "Objection!" The defense attorney barked, rising to his feet. "This is outrageous. This is a 3-year-old child. This so-called testimony is inadmissible. She doesn't understand the meaning of her words." But the damage had already been done. The jury had heard her. They had seen her tiny finger, trembling as it pointed toward the defendant. The prosecutor remained calm. "Your Honor, the child's statement was unsolicited, spontaneous, and relevant to the charges. We ask that it remain on record." The judge leaned back, weighing the arguments. He glanced at the jury. Their faces told him what he needed to know. These were not words that could be erased, no matter what ruling he gave. Finally, he struck his gavel. "The objection is overruled," he said firmly. The defense attorney sat back down. Fuming, the courtroom buzzed with whispers, until the judge silenced them with another rap of his gavel. The child, unaware of the storm she had unleashed, simply leaned back against the police dog, stroking his fur as though nothing remarkable had happened. But for everyone else in the room, the jurors, the families, the lawyers, and the judge, the world had shifted. The case had changed. The balance had tipped Dot, and all it had taken were two simple words from the mouth of a 3-year-old. The courtroom was no longer the same place it had been moments before. The air felt heavier, thicker, as though those two words had shifted the walls themselves. Bad man, simple, direct, and spoken by the smallest voice in the room. Yet somehow, they carried more weight than all the evidence, arguments, and cross-examinations combined. Jurors sat stiff in their seats, some with their mouths slightly open. A few leaned back, blinking, as though replaying the sound in their minds. The gallery was silent, frozen in collective shock. Even the court reporter, usually mechanical in her work, had to steady her hands before continuing to type. The defense attorney scrambled to regain control. He stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, I renew my objection. This is highly prejudicial. This child clearly does not understand the implications of what she just said. She's a toddler, for God's sake. We cannot let this childish remark, decide the fate of my client." The defendant sat motionless, but his jaw was tight. His eyes, cold and hard, flicked briefly toward the child. If the jury noticed that glance, and some did, it didn't help his case. The judge sighed, his face composed, but his eyes betraying a flicker of something deeper. He knew this was not just another case. "Counselor," he said firmly to the defense, "your objection has been overruled. The statement will remain in the record. The jury will determine the weight it carries." The defense attorney dropped heavily into his chair, muttering under his breath. Meanwhile, the little girl remained in the witness chair, her tiny hand still resting on the police dog's back. She looked around the courtroom with wide eyes, unaware of the ripple she had caused. For her, the words were simple truth, spoken without calculation or strategy. Children didn't weigh consequences or consider tactics. They spoke what they knew, in the language they understood. And to her, the man across the room was nothing more and nothing less than a bad man. The prosecutor took a slow, steady breath. She had handled dozens of trials, faced down hardened criminals, but never had she witnessed a moment like this. She crouched slightly, so her eyes were level with the child's. Her voice was soft, careful, almost maternal. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "can you tell us? Why is he a bad man?" The little girl hesitated. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter. Her lip trembled, and for a moment it seemed she might retreat into silence. The dog shifted closer, leaning into her, his presence like a shield. Finally, she whispered, "He hurt." The word was faint, fragile, but it sent another shiver through the room. The prosecutor didn't push further. She knew the risk of overwhelming the child. Instead, she nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with restrained emotion. "Thank you," she said softly. The defense attorney jumped up again. "Leading questions. This is outrageous. She's being manipulated." But the jury wasn't listening to him anymore. Their focus was locked on the child. Her innocence, her smallness, and her raw sincerity were undeniable. There was no calculation in her voice, no rehearsed lines. Just truth, unpolished and piercing. One juror, a mother of two, pressed her lips together tightly, fighting tears. Another juror, a retired teacher, leaned forward, his hands clenched on his knees. They weren't just listening, they were feeling. And feelings were dangerous ground for the defense. The prosecutor straightened and stepped back, signaling she was done with questions. "No further questions, Your Honor." The judge nodded, turning to the defense. "Cross-examination?" The defense attorney hesitated. He knew this was a lose-lose situation. Badgering a 3-year-old in front of a jury would make him look cruel. Yet saying nothing might leave the testimony unchallenged. He rose reluctantly, tugging at his tie. Approaching the stand, he forced a smile that came off stiff and insincere. "Hello there," he said, his voice awkward. "You're a very smart girl, aren't you?" The child didn't answer. She stared at him with wide eyes, shrinking slightly closer to the dog. He cleared his throat. "You like dogs, don't you?" She nodded. Double quotes, "And that nice doggy makes you feel safe, right?" Another nod. The attorney's smile tightened. He gestured toward the prosecutor's table. "Did someone tell you to say those words today? Did someone ask you to say, 'bad man'?" The girl frowned, her tiny brow furrowed in confusion. She didn't respond. The silence dragged on, thick and uncomfortable. The defense attorney shifted, clearly frustrated. He tried again. "Do you even know what it means to tell the truth?" Before the judge could intervene, the little girl did something unexpected. She leaned into the dog, patted his back softly, and whispered something into his ear. The dog tilted his head slightly, as though listening. The jury chuckled quietly, the tension breaking just enough for the defense's credibility to falter. The judge banged his gavel lightly. "Counselor, I think that's enough." The attorney scowled, but retreated to his table, muttering about the circus this had become. The little girl remained seated for a moment longer. She looked at the judge, then at the prosecutor, then back at the dog. Finally, she slid down from the chair, holding tightly to her stuffed rabbit. The handler guided the dog as the child walked out of the courtroom, her tiny steps echoing in the silence she left behind. Only after the doors closed did the room seem to breathe again. The prosecutor rose to address the court. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you just witnessed was not rehearsed or manipulated. That was the unfiltered voice of a child, identifying the man who hurt her. Sometimes the simplest truths are the most powerful." The defense slammed a hand on the table. "We will not allow the fate of this case to hinge on the words of a toddler." But the jurors weren't looking at him. Their minds were still replaying the moment. The small child, her trembling voice, her finger pointing across the room, and those two devastating words. The trial continued, evidence still to be presented, arguments still to be made. But everyone knew the turning point had already come. The scales had tipped, not through charts or testimony from experts, but through the courage of a 3-year-old who dared to speak. The headlines were already writing themselves in reporters' notebooks. Toddler breaks silence in court, calls defendant bad man. And though the trial was far from over, one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The silence after the child left lingered like a shadow over the courtroom. It was as though her two simple words, "bad man," had carved into the very walls, leaving everyone unable to shake the echo. The jury sat rigid, their faces pale, their eyes darting toward the defendant, as if seeing him for the first time in an entirely different light. The prosecutor returned to her seat slowly, deliberately, knowing she didn't need to add anything more. She had seen it, the shift in the jurors' expressions, the tremor of raw emotion that no amount of defense strategy could erase. The testimony was brief, perhaps the shortest she'd ever encountered in her career, but it had left an impact deeper than hours of legal arguments. The defense attorney, however, was not ready to surrender. He straightened his tie, stood with a force that made his chair rattle, and addressed the jury directly. His voice rose in frustration, tinged with desperation. "Ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you, this is a court of law. Justice must be decided by evidence, not by the words of a frightened child, barely old enough to understand what day it is. What you heard was manipulation, pure and simple. She was led here, brought in front of you with a police dog, and encouraged to point the finger at my client. You must not let your emotions dictate a man's future. His voice rang through the chamber, but it lacked conviction. He knew it, and so did the jury. The judge rapped his gavel sharply. That's enough, counselor. Sit down. The defense attorney hesitated, then obeyed, sinking back into his chair. His client leaned toward him, whispering something angrily, but the attorney only shook his head. It was clear he was rattled. The jury's eyes told the story. Some leaned forward, brows furrowed, others leaned back, arms crossed, but all of them looked shaken. They weren't ready to dismiss the child's words, no matter what the defense said. The prosecutor rose calmly. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to proceed with additional testimony and evidence. But let us not forget, truth often comes in the simplest form. Today, we saw truth. A murmur swept through the gallery, parents clutching tissues, reporters scribbling faster than ever. The next witness, a child psychologist, was sworn in. She had been working closely with the victims' families, observing the children's behavior since the alleged abuse surfaced. She began by explaining the difficulty of extracting testimony from toddlers, noting that many lacked the vocabulary to describe what happened. But, she continued, children this young often express truth in the clearest ways. They may not give detailed stories, but their words, gestures, and emotional responses are powerful indicators, especially when those words emerge spontaneously, without prompting. The prosecutor asked, Doctor, based on your professional expertise, do you believe the words spoken by the witness today, bad man, could have been rehearsed or coached? The psychologist shook her head firmly. In my opinion, no. The child's response was natural, unplanned, and delivered while she was focused on the comfort animal. That makes it far more credible than if she had been directly prompted. The defense sprang to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is speculation. The judge considered for a moment before responding, overruled. The witness may continue. The psychologist elaborated, her words carefully chosen, her tone steady. What you witnessed was a child finding her voice in the safest way possible. Her identification carries weight, even if brief. Jurors scribbled notes. Others nodded faintly. The defense cross-examined, trying to chip away at her authority. Doctor, isn't it true that children can be influenced easily? That they might repeat things told to them by adults? Yes, she agreed calmly. Children can be suggestible. But there is a clear difference between repeating phrases and producing spontaneous, emotionally driven identification. What we saw today was the latter. The defense scowled, frustrated that his attempts to discredit her fell flat. As the afternoon wore on, more evidence was introduced. Medical reports documented unexplained bruises on several children, including the little girl who testified. Photographs of the daycare environment were shown. Peeling paint, locked closets, and areas that raised serious safety concerns. Parents gave testimony about the changes in their children after attending the daycare. Nightmares, fear of returning, sudden aggression, or withdrawal. The defense objected at nearly every turn, but the rhythm of the trial had shifted. The jury wasn't just hearing evidence anymore. They were connecting it back to the small, trembling voice that had whispered "bad man" earlier that day. Each piece of evidence seemed to underscore her words, weaving together a narrative that was becoming harder and harder to ignore. During a short recess, whispers filled the hallways outside. Reporters huddled near the doors, some already typing out headlines on their laptops. Parents of other children whispered prayers, their eyes red from both exhaustion and hope. Inside the courtroom, the jurors returned from the break, their faces taut with focus. They were no longer casual observers. They were participants in something that felt larger than themselves, the possibility of delivering justice not just for one child, but for many. When the trial resumed, the prosecutor addressed the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we saw the courage of a child. And in the days to come, you will see how that courage is supported by evidence, testimony, and truth. Justice demands that we listen, even when the voice is small." The defense, desperate, pushed back hard. "This is not justice. This is emotional theater. My client is on trial for his life, and the prosecution wants you to believe the ramblings of a toddler." But as he spoke, the jurors' expressions told the real story. Their eyes were distant, their thoughts fixed on the image of the little girl clutching her rabbit and leaning on the police dog. That picture had burned itself into their minds. The rest of the day moved quickly, but the heart of it had already happened. The child's words had become the center around which everything revolved. Her testimony had cracked the defense's confidence, rattled the courtroom, and changed the course of the trial. As the judge adjourned for the evening, people filed out in silence. Some jurors glanced at each other, sharing looks heavy with unspoken thoughts. The defendant left quickly, his face twisted in anger, his attorney whispering hurried strategies that sounded more like damage control than confidence. The prosecutor gathered her files calmly, but inside, she felt the tremor of something extraordinary. She knew trials weren't won in a single moment, but sometimes they could be lost in one. And for the defense, today might have been that moment. The families left with cautious hope, holding on to the memory of a brave child who dared to speak the truth. And somewhere far from the noise of the courtroom, a little girl was back in her guardian's arms, playing quietly with her stuffed rabbit, unaware that her two small words had shaken the foundations of justice. The fifth day of the trial began under heavy skies. Rain pattered against the courthouse windows, casting long streaks down the glass, as though the heavens themselves were mourning for the children whose lives had been scarred. Inside, the air buzzed with anticipation. Everyone sensed it. The trial had reached a turning point. Jurors filed into the box with a new weight in their steps. Their faces betrayed sleepless nights, the kind of restlessness that comes when one carries the responsibility of justice. Some clutched pens tighter than before. Others leaned forward, eager, as if bracing for what was to come. The defendant entered with his head low, his shoulders stiff. The confidence that once clung to him like armor had been cracked. His eyes darted around the room, never settling, never steady. He knew the jury had seen something they couldn't unsee. He knew the words of a child had pierced through the strongest walls his defense had tried to build. The defense attorney, however, was determined to salvage what he could. He whispered rapidly to his client, then stood and faced the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we will show that appearances can deceive. That what you think you saw and what you think you heard may not be the truth. Children may say things without understanding them. Evidence may appear convincing, but upon closer examination, it falls apart. My client deserves fairness, not sentimentality." The jury listened, but their expressions were guarded. They had heard this before. They were waiting for proof, not words. The prosecutor began her day by calling forward an investigator, the lead detective assigned to the case. He was a tall, composed man, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming faintly under the courtroom lights. The jurors leaned in as he took the oath, then sat straight in the witness chair. He recounted the months of investigation, how multiple parents had come forward, each telling eerily similar stories about their children's nightmares and fears. He spoke of searching the daycare, finding hidden closets with locks on the inside, shelves stocked with items no child should have access to, and journals belonging to the defendant that detailed routines and discipline techniques he claimed to use. At one point, the prosecutor lifted a photograph into the air. It showed the small, dark closet, no larger than a pantry, with nothing inside but a chair and a single dangling light bulb. The courtroom gasped. "Detective," the prosecutor asked softly, "what did you determine this closet was used for?" The detective's jaw tightened. "We believe it was used as a punishment room." Several children described being locked inside, alone, in the dark. The defense attorney immediately jumped to his feet. Objection. Speculation. But the judge, after a pause, shook his head. Overruled. The witness may answer based on his investigation. The detective continued, his voice steady, though his eyes burned with quiet anger. The children's stories matched what we discovered. They spoke of the bad man locking them away. Some described the chair. Others described the light bulb swinging above their heads. The jurors shifted uncomfortably, some swallowing hard. The image was too vivid, too real. The prosecutor then played a short audio clip. It was a recording of one child during an early interview with investigators. A trembling voice could be heard whispering, "He put me in the room. I don't like the dark. He said I was bad." The words were faint, muffled, but they struck like thunder in the silence. Reporters scribbled furiously, and even the judge leaned forward with a solemn expression. The defense attorney fought back, pacing before the jury with exaggerated steps. Children imagine things. They fear the dark. They invent monsters. Isn't it possible these children, frightened and vulnerable, created stories from their fears? Stories that investigators interpreted as evidence against my client? The detective didn't flinch. "I've interviewed hundreds of children in my career. There are inconsistencies in fabricated stories. What struck me here was the consistency. Children from different families, interviewed separately, described the same details. The closet, the chair, the dark, and one more thing." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. They all used the same phrase, "bad man." A collective shiver ran through the courtroom. The jury's eyes widened, their pens stilled mid-sentence. That phrase had already seared itself into their memory. Now it was undeniable. It wasn't just one child. It was many. The prosecutor allowed the silence to stretch, then nodded. No further questions. The defense attempted a cross-examination, but the jurors' expressions revealed his failure before his words even ended. They were listening, but not believing. As the day progressed, more evidence surfaced. Medical experts testified about stress-related symptoms in the children, bedwetting, sleep terrors, and developmental regressions. Parents described the helplessness of watching their once vibrant children shrink into fear and silence. The jury's notebooks filled with underlined words. Closet, dark, bad man. By the late afternoon, the prosecution rested for the day, leaving the courtroom heavy with emotion. The defense scrambled, calling a character witness, a neighbor of the defendant who swore he was a kind man, always helpful. But even as she spoke, her words felt hollow, flimsy against the avalanche of evidence. The jury barely looked at her. They kept glancing instead at the photographs of the daycare, at their notes, at one another. When the judge dismissed them for the evening, the jurors left quietly, their faces pale, their steps slow. They carried more than just the weight of evidence now. They carried the haunting voices of children who had whispered their pain in words too small for the world to ignore. The defendant was escorted out, his jaw clenched, his fists tight. He glared at the prosecutor, but she didn't meet his eyes. She knew where the trial was heading. She could feel it, as could everyone else in the gallery. The little girl's guardian clutched her hand, whispering that everything would be okay. The child, innocent of the storm her words had unleashed, smiled faintly, distracted by her stuffed rabbit. She had no idea that her voice had become the key that unlocked the truth for so many others. And as the rain continued to fall outside, streaking the courthouse windows like tears, The world waited for what would come next. The tide had turned, and justice was no longer a distant hope. It was drawing near. The courtroom felt heavier the following morning. The rain had stopped, but the air carried a restless chill, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Jurors shuffled in with cautious glances at the defendant, whose expression flickered between anger and fear. He knew his fate dangled by a thread. The defense attorney, however, came armed with a new strategy. Gone was the measured calm of earlier days. His tone was sharper, more forceful, as if sheer energy could undo the damage of the past week. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, striding before them with quick, practiced steps. "We live in a nation where justice must be guided by proof, not whispers, not shadows, not imagination. The prosecution has paraded emotions before you. They've shown photographs meant to scare you, played recordings meant to tug at your heart. But I will show you today that these so-called facts are flimsy, circumstantial, and dangerous to rely upon." His words echoed through the chamber. Some jurors scribbled notes. Others stared blankly, waiting to see if he had anything new to offer. The defense called its first expert witness, a child development specialist. She testified about memory formation in young children, explaining how kids under 5 often blur dreams and reality. "Children this young," she said, "may repeat words they hear from adults. They may misinterpret situations. They may even convince themselves something happened when it did not." The defense attorney seized on her words. "So when a 3-year-old says bad man, is it possible she's repeating what someone else told her?" "Absolutely," the witness replied. "It's possible." The defense turned dramatically toward the jury. "There you have it. The cornerstone of the prosecution's case rests on the fragile words of children too young to distinguish truth from suggestion." The prosecutor rose for cross-examination, her tone precise and controlled. "Doctor, are you aware that multiple children from different families interviewed separately described the same closet, the same chair, the same phrase?" The expert hesitated. "Yes, I reviewed the reports." "Then tell us," the prosecutor pressed, "how children too young to understand memory could, without speaking to each other, give the same descriptions? Isn't that consistency the very definition of reliability?" The courtroom held its breath. The witness faltered. "Consistency can be compelling, yes, but it doesn't erase the possibility of influence." "Possibility," the prosecutor repeated, her voice firm. "But probability? Certainty?" The witness shifted uncomfortably. "No, not certainty." The prosecutor let the silence hang, then calmly returned to her seat. The damage was done. The defense moved on, calling the defendant's former coworker to the stand. He painted a picture of a gentle man, someone who would never harm a child. He spoke of charity drives, volunteer work, and cheerful greetings at the daycare's front desk. But as he spoke, his voice quivered. The jurors noticed. The more he insisted on the defendant's kindness, the less convincing he became. The prosecutor's cross-examination was surgical. "Sir, did you ever work in the daycare rooms?" "No." "Were you ever present when children were disciplined?" "No." "Then your testimony is based not on direct knowledge of the defendant's conduct with children, but on surface impressions. Correct?" The witness nodded reluctantly. The jurors scribbled furiously. Another hole in the defense. Sensing the weakness, the defense attorney doubled down, bringing in a psychologist who testified about false memory syndrome. He explained how media attention and parental fears could shape children's recollections. "Once an idea is planted," he said, "a child may genuinely believe it happened, even if it did not." The defense latched onto this. "So, doctor, the so-called punishment closet may simply be a fantasy? A shared story among frightened children, reinforced by parents and investigators?" "It's possible," the psychologist confirmed. The prosecutor rose slowly. Her questions cut with precision. Doctor, in your professional opinion, would multiple children from unrelated families, interviewed separately, invent identical details about a closet they feared? The psychologist hesitated. It would be unusual. Unusual, the prosecutor repeated, her eyes narrowing. Or implausible. The psychologist adjusted his glasses. Implausible, but not impossible. The jurors exchanged glances. They could hear the cracks in the defense's argument. The day wore on with testimony after testimony, the defense scrambling to rebuild ground lost earlier in the trial. They tried to portray the children as confused, the parents as overprotective, the investigators as biased. But each argument stumbled against the weight of what the jury had already seen and heard. The image of the little girl clutching her stuffed rabbit, whispering, "Bad man," hovered over every word spoken. The defense couldn't erase it by mid-afternoon. Tension coiled tighter. The defense attorney, his voice rising with frustration, shouted during cross-examination of a parent witness. "Isn't it true you hate my client? Isn't it true you influenced your child to accuse him because you wanted someone to blame?" The parent, tears streaking down her face, shook her head violently. "I wanted my child to feel safe again. That's all I ever wanted." The jury's faces hardened. The judge rapped his gavel sharply. "Control yourself, counselor." But the damage was irreversible. The defense appeared desperate, lashing out, instead of presenting clarity. By the time the judge adjourned for the evening, the atmosphere was electric with unease. The jury filed out silently, burdened not just with facts, but with emotions the defense couldn't shake from their minds. The defendant rose, his face flushed with anger, whispering harshly to his lawyer. He glanced at the jury with narrowed eyes, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. That look of simmering rage did not go unnoticed. In the gallery, the little girl's guardian pulled her close, shielding her from the tension. The police dog rested at her feet, ever steady, ever calm. The child leaned into the animal's fur, whispering something only it could hear. For her, the trial was just a confusing blur of long days and strange faces. For everyone else, it was a battle for truth. Outside, as night fell, the courthouse lights glowed against the darkness. Reporters huddled under umbrellas, delivering live broadcasts. Headlines already spoke of a defense on shaky ground, and a prosecution tightening its grip. And inside those courthouse walls, one undeniable truth remained. The words of a child had set a chain reaction in motion. No strategy, no expert, no polished argument could fully undo them. The defense had struck back with every weapon they had. But the tide was no longer in their favor. The endgame was approaching. The seventh day of the trial dawned clear and cold, sunlight streaming through the courthouse windows as if to spotlight the gravity of what was about to unfold. Inside, every seat in the gallery was filled. Parents, reporters, and community members had come to witness the final stretch of a case that had gripped the nation. The jury filed in, their faces more solemn than ever. Days of testimony had carved deep lines of fatigue and reflection into their expressions. They carried notebooks filled with observations, but more than that, they carried the invisible burden of truth. The prosecution rose first. It was time for closing arguments. The lead prosecutor, a woman known for her calm precision, stepped into the well of the courtroom. She didn't bring notes. She didn't need them. Her voice, steady yet filled with conviction, carried through the chamber. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "this trial has shown you evidence, testimony, and truth. You have heard from experts. You have seen the daycare photographs. You have listened to the parents of frightened children. But above all else, you heard a child speak. 2 words. Bad man. And those words echoed across every piece of evidence we presented. They are the thread tying this case together." She paused, letting her words settle. Some jurors shifted in their seats, their eyes never leaving her. "We are not here because of imagination or exaggeration," she continued. "We are here because multiple children, from different homes, described the same horrors. The closet, the chair, the fear, the nightmares. All of it points back to one man." Her hand lifted, pointing toward the defendant. His face flushed, his eyes darting to the ground. "This man," she said firmly, "betrayed the trust of parents, of children, and of this community. He hid cruelty behind the mask of care, and he thought no one would believe the smallest voices. But those voices have spoken, and they have told us the truth." The jury sat frozen, hanging on every word. The prosecutor's voice softened. "Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it comes in whispers. Sometimes it comes in the trembling voice of a 3-year-old child clutching her stuffed rabbit, leaning against a police dog for courage. Justice demands that we hear her. Justice demands that we act." She returned to her seat, leaving a silence that weighed heavily in the air. The defense attorney rose next, his face pale, his movements sharp. His closing argument was his last chance. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, pacing quickly before the jury, "you are being asked to decide a man's future based on fear, not fact. On emotion, not evidence. Yes, the testimony was moving. Yes, the photographs were disturbing. But ask yourselves this. Did anyone witness my client committing a crime? Is there irrefutable proof, beyond any doubt, that he harmed these children? Or are you being swayed by stories? Stories planted in the minds of frightened children and desperate parents?" He stopped, looking each juror in the eye. "You swore to uphold the law. The law demands proof. And proof is missing here. Do not let sympathy take the place of justice." His words were sharp, but the desperation behind them was clear. His client fidgeted nervously at the table, eyes flashing with anger, as if he, too, sensed the walls closing in. The prosecutor rose briefly for rebuttal. "Proof has been shown to you. Maybe not the kind captured in photographs or video, but proof in testimony, in medical records, in patterns that cannot be denied. Proof in the courage of children who found their voices. Do not mistake the absence of spectacle for the absence of truth." The judge gave final instructions, his voice firm, urging the jury to weigh the evidence carefully and set aside bias. Then, with a rap of the gavel, the case was handed over. The jury retired to deliberate. Hours passed. The courthouse hummed with tension, whispers echoing through hallways. Parents clasped hands, reporters refreshed their notes, and lawyers paced silently inside the deliberation room. 12 strangers wrestled with the fate of one man. They replayed testimony, reread their notes, and debated fiercely. Some jurors argued for caution. "We must be sure," they said. Others insisted the pattern was undeniable. Too many children, too many details. The phrase "bad man" surfaced again and again. One juror, her voice breaking, said, "I can't forget the way she said it. She wasn't lying. You could feel it." Another juror countered, "But feelings aren't evidence. We have to be certain." The hours stretched into the evening. Dinner was brought in, uneaten by most. They pored over every detail, every testimony, weighing the possibility of doubt against the mountain of consistency. Finally, as night deepened, a decision began to form. One by one, hands rose around the table. The majority was clear. The next morning, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The air was electric, the silence deafening. The defendant sat rigid, his face pale. His attorney leaned close, whispering last-minute words of reassurance that sounded hollow, even to himself. The prosecutor sat still, her hands folded neatly, her eyes steady. She knew what was coming. The judge asked the foreperson if the jury had reached a verdict. "Yes, Your Honor," came the reply. Every heart in the courtroom pounded. Parents leaned forward, reporters clutched their pens, and the little girl's guardian held her close, shielding her eyes though. She didn't understand the gravity of the moment. The verdict was about to be read. And in that suspended breath before the words were spoken, the courtroom became a place where time itself seemed to stop, a place where whispers of truth had finally grown loud enough to demand justice. The courtroom was silent as the foreperson of the jury rose, the gavel's echo from the judge's last session still lingering like a heartbeat. Every eye followed her, every breath held. The defendant sat rigid, hands clenched, his face pale but stubborn. His attorney whispered hurriedly, though it was clear even he knew the walls were closing in. The foreperson cleared her throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant." The pause stretched impossibly long, the room holding its collective breath. Outside, rain had started again, tapping against the windows as though nature itself were listening. Guilty on all charges. A murmur swept through the gallery, quickly stifled by the judge's stern gavel. The words hung heavy in the air. Guilty, the simplest word, yet carrying decades of consequences, a lifetime of truth vindicated, and the promise of protection for the smallest victims. The defendant's jaw tightened. His hands shot to his lap, trembling. He looked around frantically, disbelief painted across his face. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, muttering words he didn't hear. His world had collapsed in a single verdict. The judge leaned forward. "This court acknowledges the courage shown by the young witnesses, and especially the bravery of the child who first spoke out. Justice has been served today not just for her, but for all the children who could not speak for themselves." The courtroom exhaled collectively. Some cried quietly, tears streaking down faces that had been tense for days. Parents hugged their children tightly, relief washing over them like a sudden, warm tide. The little girl clutched her stuffed rabbit, and the police dog stayed faithfully at her side, calm and steady, a silent hero to the adults who had witnessed the day's extraordinary events. Reporters scribbled and clicked, capturing every detail. Headlines already formed in their minds. Podler's brave words lead to conviction. Justice for the children. Bad man found guilty. Courage in the courtroom. One small voice changes everything. The defense attorney rose, his face pale, struggling for composure. "Your Honor," he said, his voice tight, "we intend to appeal." The judge nodded solemnly. "You may. But for today, justice has been rendered. This verdict reflects the evidence, the testimonies, and the bravery of witnesses who spoke the truth." The defendant was escorted from the courtroom, silent except for the rustle of his restraints. His eyes briefly met the little girl's as he passed. She didn't react. She only clutched the dog a little tighter, the stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest. She was too young to fully understand the enormity of what had happened, but even she seemed to sense that something important had changed. Outside, the parents of the other children waited. They hugged each other tightly, a mix of exhaustion and relief evident on their faces. Some wept openly. Others stood stiffly, overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. The prosecutor stepped outside moments later, smiling faintly as the crowd of journalists swarmed. "This was a case about courage and truth," she said. And today, justice was not determined by size, age, or voice. It was determined by honesty and bravery. That child, and all the children who testified, have reminded us of what's truly important. Sometimes the smallest voices speak the loudest truths. The police dog sat calmly nearby, eyes alert, tail resting gently on the ground. His handler knelt beside him, stroking his fur. The little girl leaned in, whispering something soft into his ear. He tilted his head, ever patient, ever protective. In the days that followed, the case became national news. Experts debated the power of child testimony. Psychologists wrote op-eds about trauma, memory, and courage. The story of the 3-year-old who said, "Bad man," traveled far beyond the courtroom walls, touching hearts across the country. The family received an outpouring of support. Letters arrived from strangers who had been moved by the child's bravery. Parents wrote to share stories of their own children, finding courage in the smallest ways. Communities held vigils, not in sorrow, but in acknowledgement of the strength of truth and the importance of listening to the young. For the little girl, life gradually returned to its normal rhythm: playdates, bedtime stories, the occasional scraped knee. But something had changed inside her. Somewhere deep in her 3-year-old heart, she had discovered the power of her own voice. And though she might not understand the magnitude of her actions, the adults around her never forgot. The police dog, once just a companion in the courtroom, became a symbol of safety and courage. He was honored in local ceremonies, celebrated not just as a trained officer, but as the silent witness to one of the most extraordinary acts of bravery anyone could imagine. Months later, the daycare was permanently closed. Investigations into other facilities in the area led to improved safety regulations and oversight. Parents felt a renewed sense of vigilance, but also hope. Change, driven by the courage of the smallest, most vulnerable among them, was possible. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of the city, a little girl hugged her rabbit tightly, unaware of how her 2 small words had changed the lives of so many. "Bad man," she had said, and in saying it, she had changed everything. The courtroom, the jurors, the parents, and the world remembered that day forever. Not for the anger or fear, but for the power of innocence, honesty, and courage. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it comes on the softest voice imaginable, a voice so small, so fragile, that the world would never expect it to carry the weight of truth. In this case, it did. And for everyone who had watched, listened, and waited, the memory of that moment became a testament that even the smallest among us can make the loudest difference.